Captain Jake Steele Harrison had seen countless battles throughout his career. From the cold, harsh worlds on the edge of the galaxy to the oppressive jungles of foreign planets, he had fought for humanity's survival in every way imaginable. But nothing could prepare him for the summons to the court of Empress Taraxi of the Zalthar Empire. Jake stood at the entrance of the Grand Palace, gazing up at the towering spires that reached into the sky like weapons ready to strike. The Zalthar Empire was a force to be reckoned with, and Taraki, its ruthless empress, was its heart and soul. She was a being of strength and intelligence, her race known for their towering armored figures and the pride they took in their ancient traditions. The Council had called him here, believing it was time to negotiate. The Federation of Planets had long struggled with the growing power of the Zalthar, and peace was needed to prevent a full-scale war. But when Jake stepped into the heart of the palace, it became clear this was no negotiation. It was a test. Taraxi was standing at the center of a vast arena, her shining armor gleaming in the sunlight that filtered through the high windows. The Empress was a sight to behold, tall, imposing, with sharp features that reflected the coldness of her people's history. Her armor, a work of art in itself, seemed almost alive, responding to her every movement. Jake couldn't help but feel the weight of her presence. She was a living legend, feared across the galaxy, and now she had set her sights on him. "You stand before me, human," Taraxi said, her voice steady but full of authority. "Do you understand why you are here?" Jake nodded, stepping forward cautiously. "I'm here to negotiate peace, to stop a war before it begins." The Empress tilted her head slightly, her piercing eyes studying him. "You misunderstand, Captain Harrison. You are not here for peace. You are here to prove your worth." Jake's stomach tightened. He had heard the rumors. Zalthar didn't negotiate. They tested those they deemed worthy of their time, and the tests were not of diplomacy or rhetoric. They were battles, pure and simple. He had been summoned to fight, not for peace, but for survival. Before Jake could speak, the ground beneath him rumbled. He looked around, seeing massive doors at the far end of the arena slowly open. A roar of engines filled the air as a towering, mechanized opponent stepped into view. It was a war machine, a massive creature built for battle, covered in thick armor and armed with devastating weapons. Taraxi's voice rang out, cutting through the tension. "This is your trial. Defeat this champion, and you will earn my respect. Fail, and you will die here, your body a testament to humanity's failure." Jake's heart raced. The battle wasn't just a simple duel, but he wasn't fighting for victory, he was fighting for his life. He quickly assessed the situation, his mind working fast. His military training kicked in, and he could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins. He had faced many foes in his time, but nothing like this. The war machine was built for destruction, a true weapon of war. But Jake had something that it didn't: a human mind, quick thinking, and the ability to adapt to any situation. The machine charged forward, its massive legs pounding the ground. Jake leaped to the side, narrowly avoiding the initial strike. The war machine swung its arm, a massive blade slicing through the air, but Jake was already moving, rolling across the ground to regain his footing. He drew his plasma rifle, aiming for weak spots in the machine's armor. The first shot hit, but it did little damage. The armor was too thick. He needed a plan, and fast. Jake darted around the machine, using the arena's structure to his advantage. His mind raced, calculating his next move. He couldn't just rely on brute force. He needed to outsmart it. The machine's movements were slow but powerful, predictable in its aggression. If he could lure it into a vulnerable position, he might have a chance. The war machine swung its arm again, but this time, Jake was ready. He ducked under the blade, sprinting forward and leaping onto the machine's back. It tried to shake him off, but Jake held on tightly, using his strength and agility to climb higher. The machine let out a screech as Jake reached its central core, the weak spot he had identified. With a swift move, he deployed a high-powered explosive charge. The blast tore through the machine's armor, sending it crashing to the ground in a massive explosion. Jake stood over the wreckage, breathing heavily. His heart was still racing, but he had done it. He had defeated the war machine. The arena was silent for a moment, but then the sound of clapping echoed through the halls. Taraxi stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "You have impressed me, human," she said, her voice filled with a hint of admiration. "But your trial is not yet complete." Jake's stomach sank. He had hoped that the battle was the end, but it seemed he was wrong. Taraxi was not one to give in so easily.
"What do you mean?" he asked, trying to steady his breath. Taraxi's eyes narrowed.
"I will tell you this. Your duel is not over. You have earned your life today, but you are bound by a law older than my empire. If you survive, you must marry me before the sun sets, or face death." Jake stared at her, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. "Marry you?" He couldn't believe his ears. "Why would I?" Taraxi cut him off. "The Zalfar have long followed this tradition. A champion who survives my trials must be bound to me in marriage. It is not negotiable. You have 6 hours to accept or refuse. Choose wisely, Captain Harrison."
Jake stood in stunned silence.
Marry the Empress? The very idea was ludicrous. But then he thought about his options. If he refused, he would be killed, and the war with the Zalthara would ignite. But if he agreed, what would his life look like? Would he be married to a woman he had just met, a woman who was his enemy only moments before? The thought felt absurd, but he could not deny the gravity of the situation. "I have no choice," Jake muttered under his breath. Taraxi gave a small nod, as if she had expected his response. "No, you do not. You will marry me, or you will die here, Captain." Jake clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had come here to secure peace, but instead, he found himself fighting for something far greater: his life, his future, and the future of humanity. He had just 6 hours to figure out how to survive this marriage. Time was running out, and he had no idea what he was about to face. The arena seemed to close in on him. As Taraxi turned away, her imposing figure disappearing into the distance, Jake was left standing there, alone, as the sound of the ticking clock echoed in his mind. Jake stood motionless in the center of the arena, his mind reeling from the weight of Taraxi's words. He had fought for his life, won the duel, and now he was faced with an impossible choice: marry the Empress of the Zalthar Empire, or die. The idea seemed ludicrous. How could he, a human soldier, possibly marry someone like her? A ruler of a powerful alien empire known for its fierce warriors and cold calculations. And yet, the clock was ticking. He had only 6 hours to decide, and he couldn't afford to waste a single moment. Taraxi's imposing figure was already retreating into the shadows, leaving Jake standing there with nothing but the sound of his own breath filling the arena. His thoughts were clouded with confusion and disbelief. He had come here with the sole purpose of securing peace for humanity, not becoming a political pawn in some alien empire's ritual. He had never imagined such an outcome. A low hum filled the air, and Jake turned to see the doors of the arena slowly close behind him, sealing off any escape. His instincts told him to run, but where would he go? The Zalthar Empire spanned across a vast region of the galaxy, and his presence here had already been deemed significant. No matter what choice he made, the consequences would affect more than just him. This marriage or death would shape the future of the galaxy itself. The ground beneath his feet felt heavy as he walked slowly toward the exit, his mind still spinning. What had he gotten himself into? He had faced alien creatures and battle-hardened soldiers before, but none of those challenges felt as impossible as this. Marrying Taraxi? It was madness. Jake's boots clicked against the marble floor as he made his way through the palace halls, still grappling with the situation. He wasn't one to back down from a fight, but this was different. This wasn't about honor or survival. It was about something much deeper: political power, control, and perhaps even something he couldn't yet understand. He reached the doors of his quarters, only to find them already open. Inside, a servant was waiting for him. The servant, a slender figure with the distinctive features of the Zalthar, bowed respectfully as Jake entered. "Captain Harrison," the servant said, their voice soft but firm. "The Empress requests your presence in 1 hour. Please prepare yourself." Jake didn't speak immediately. Instead, he turned toward the window, gazing out at the stars. The vastness of space seemed to stretch on endlessly, a constant reminder that everything he knew and fought for could be lost in the blink of an eye. What was the point of surviving the duel only to face this strange and twisted fate? He had no answers, only more questions. He exhaled deeply, forcing himself to push the uncertainty aside. Time was running out. He had to make a choice, and he needed to understand Traxi better before he could make any decision. He couldn't marry someone, especially someone as dangerous and powerful as her, without knowing more about who she truly was. With resolve settling in his chest, Jake nodded to the servant. "Tell the Empress I'll be there." The servant gave a short bow and exited the room, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts once again. He sat down at a table in the center of the room, staring at his hands. He didn't know what awaited him in the next hour, but he couldn't afford to stand still. He had to think, and more importantly, he had to understand Taraxi, not just as a ruler, but as a person. He had seen the strength in her eyes during the duel. He had felt the weight of her power. But there had been something else there, too, something softer, something that didn't quite match her fierce reputation. Was it possible that there was more to her than the cold warrior he had seen in the arena? Jake stood up and paced the room. He had been trained for war, for strategy, for surviving impossible odds, but none of that prepared him for this. He had to keep his wits about him. If he was going to survive this situation, he needed to understand the game he was being forced to play. And the only way to do that was to meet Taraxi head-on, to face her without fear or hesitation. An hour later, Jake was standing outside the door to the Empress's chambers. The grand doors were adorned with intricate designs, telling the story of the Zalthar Empire's victories and conquests. He had always respected the Zalthar warriors' ability to dominate their enemies, but now, facing Taraxi, he couldn't help but wonder if he was stepping into the unknown. The servant from earlier was there to greet him once again. She led him inside where Taraxi awaited him. The room was dimly lit, the glow of distant stars casting a soft light through the high windows. Taraxi stood at the center of the room, her armor gleaming even in the low light, and her eyes were fixed on Jake as he entered. "Captain Harrison," Taraxi spoke, her voice as calm and composed as ever. "I trust you are ready to make your decision?" Jake didn't respond immediately. He was studying her, trying to gauge her emotions, to see if he could find a hint of vulnerability behind her cold exterior. Taraxi had to know the power she held over him, over everyone, really. She was the ruler of the Zalthar Empire, and she had just issued him a command he couldn't refuse. But there was something in her eyes, something that made him pause. She wasn't just a conqueror. She was a leader who carried the weight of her people's future. There was a burden there that Jake hadn't seen before. She was powerful, yes, but she was also human in ways that went beyond the armor she wore. "I don't understand," Jake said finally, his voice steady.
Why me? You could have chosen anyone.
Why marry a human? Taraxi's expression remained unreadable, but Jake could see the slightest shift in her stance, as though she was contemplating the question more seriously than he had anticipated. "The Zalthar have always been a warrior race," she began. "We conquer, we fight, we dominate, but we are also fractured. My people are divided, rival factions fight for power, and we are at risk of tearing ourselves apart from within. You humans, despite your flaws, have something we lack: unity. You fight for each other. You protect your own. And that strength is something we have forgotten over the centuries. Jake didn't speak. He simply listened, trying to make sense of her words.
You may not believe me, Taraxi continued, but I have no desire to continue the wars that have defined my reign.
I am not like the other rulers of my people. I want peace, but to achieve it, I must bind my people together. And that can only be done by a symbol of unity. Our marriage is not just about politics. It is about survival. Your survival?
And the survival of both our peoples.
Jake's eyes narrowed as he processed her words.
It wasn't what he had expected. He had thought this was about power and control, a political move to solidify her dominance. But now, he saw the truth in her words. She wasn't just a conqueror. She was a leader who was trying to save her people from destruction. His heart raced as he realized the weight of the decision before him. He wasn't just being asked to marry a stranger. He was being asked to become a part of something much larger, a symbol of hope for two civilizations on the brink of war. If he refused, it would only ignite the flames of conflict. But if he accepted, if he played along with her plan, they might just have a chance at peace.
I understand, Jake said finally, his voice low. But if I do this, if I marry you,
what then? Taraxi studied him carefully, her gaze unwavering. Then we build something new. Together, our union will be the foundation upon which our people can heal. The war will end, but it will not be easy. There are those who will not accept this marriage, and they will try to tear us apart. But if we stand together, we will have a chance. Jake's mind was made up. The path before him was uncertain, but the stakes were too high to ignore. He had to make this work. For his people, for Taraxi, for the galaxy. I'll marry you, Jake said, his voice steady.
But not because I have to. I'll do it because I believe in what we could become.
Taraxi's eyes softened ever so slightly. Then we begin. And just like that, their futures were intertwined. Together, they would face the challenges ahead, not as enemies, but as allies, bound by fate and a shared hope for a better tomorrow. The grand hall of the palace was quiet, save for the faint hum of the city beyond the walls. The air was thick with anticipation, and Jake Harrison could feel it in his bones. The reality of his situation had not yet fully settled in, and now, as he stood at the threshold of the marriage ceremony, he could sense the weight of the decisions he had made. Marrying Empress Taraxi of the Zalthar Empire wasn't just about politics. It was about survival. Not only his survival, but the survival of humanity and the galaxy at large. Jake stood in the private chambers of the Empress, the opulent furnishings around him a reminder of the grandeur and power of the Zalthar Empire. Taraxi had left him alone to prepare, her words echoing in his mind. Our union will be the foundation upon which our people can heal. It was an impossible burden to bear, but it was also his only hope. He didn't have time to dwell on the enormity of the situation. There was little he could do now to back out. The Zaldar law was absolute. If he didn't marry Taraxi within the time allotted, the consequences would be disastrous. The political ramifications would destroy the fragile peace he had fought for. But what if there was more at stake? Jake had learned more about Taraxi than he ever expected. Despite the cold exterior and the empire she commanded, there was a human side to her, a leader desperate to end the cycle of war and destruction that had plagued her people for centuries. As unlikely as it seemed, this marriage might just be the beginning of something far more important than either of them could have imagined. The minutes ticked by. Jake paced the room, running his hands through his hair. What had he gotten himself into? But as he glanced around at the ornate walls and the towering windows that looked out onto the city, his thoughts began to settle. The battle for survival was no longer about fighting alien invaders or defending his home world. It was about navigating this complicated, dangerous political web and hoping that the bonds of their unlikely union could hold the peace together. The door to the chamber opened softly, and Jake turned to see Taraxi standing in the doorway. Her presence filled the room, as it always did. She was dressed in the traditional ceremonial armor of her people, but there was something different about her today. Her armor, usually a symbol of her strength and power, was softer today, adorned with intricate symbols that reflected the deeper meaning of the ceremony they were about to undergo. Jake didn't speak at first, unsure of what to say. He had been trying to wrap his mind around the decision, but now, standing before her in the silence of the room, the weight of it all felt even more real. Taraxi's sharp gaze met his, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something softer behind her eyes. She wasn't just the Empress. She was a leader, bound by the same burdens of her people, and Jake understood that now. She had tried to maintain her stoic distance, but he could see through it. She wasn't just asking him to marry her for political reasons. She was asking him to trust her, to stand by her side, and together, they would face the challenges ahead.
Are you ready? Taraxi's voice was calm, but there was an edge of uncertainty to it. She wasn't asking about the ceremony.
She was asking about the choice Jake had made. Jake took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what the answer was, but he had to face it. I don't know if I'm ready, Jake admitted, his voice low.
But I know I don't have any other choice.
Taraxi studied him for a moment before nodding. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Her armor clicked softly with each movement, and Jake could feel the intensity of her presence as she stood beside him. I know this is not what you expected, she said quietly.
But we have to make this work, for the sake of our people.
For the sake of the galaxy. Jake nodded, his resolve strengthening. This wasn't just about survival. This was about a future neither of them could foresee. They were walking into an unknown future together, one that would challenge everything they knew about war, peace, and leadership. The path ahead would not be easy, but it was a path they would walk together. The moments that followed felt surreal. The palace seemed to come alive with whispers as the news spread. The Empress was about to marry the human captain. It was unheard of, unprecedented. It was the beginning of something new, but it was also the start of a new chapter of uncertainty. Jake glanced out of the window, where the stars in the distance twinkled like scattered diamonds. They had no idea what was coming next, but it was clear that this union could change everything.
We should go, Taraxi said, her voice breaking through his thoughts.
She turned toward the door, her steps measured and confident. Jake followed her, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him with each passing step. He had made this choice not for love or personal gain, but because he believed in the chance for peace. As they walked through the corridors of the palace, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that everything was moving too quickly. He wasn't sure if this was the right path, but as Taraxi's presence surrounded him, he felt a strange sense of calm. She was a leader, one who carried the weight of her people on her shoulders, and she was offering him the chance to help carry that weight. Together, they would face what was to come. But first, they had to survive the ceremony. When they reached the grand hall, the entire room fell silent. The Zalthar nobility stood in their ceremonial attire, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disapproval. But there was nothing they could do now. The law had been set in motion, and nothing could stop it. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the raised platform at the center of the hall. The marriage ceremony would not be a simple affair. The Zalthar's traditions were complex, steeped in ancient rituals that were as much about symbolism as they were about power. The room was filled with the scent of incense, and the light of the stars filtered through the windows, casting a soft glow on the proceedings. Taraxi stepped up to the platform, her posture straight and dignified. Jake followed her, feeling the eyes of the gathered nobility on him. They were judging him, scrutinizing his every move. But he kept his focus on Taurasi, who stood at the center of it all, her strength apparent even in the quietest moments. The ceremony began in silence, with ancient Zalthar chants filling the air. The words were foreign to Jake, but their meaning was clear. This was a union that would bind their fates together. The power of the Zalthar would be combined with the strength of humanity, forging a new path forward. As the ceremony continued, Jake's thoughts began to settle. This wasn't just a marriage. It was the beginning of something much larger, a partnership that could bring about the end of centuries of war and division. He didn't know what the future held, but as he stood there facing Taurasi, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone in this. They would face the challenges ahead together. The final part of the ceremony arrived, the moment when Jake would have to make his vow. The Zalthar held their breath, waiting for him to speak. He had never been good with words, but this was different. He wasn't speaking for them. He was speaking for the future. He stepped forward, his voice strong and steady. I, Captain Jake Harrison, vow to stand by you, Empress Taurasi, in peace and war. I vow to fight for our future, for the future of our people, and for the galaxy we both serve. Together we will build something new, something stronger than what we have known. Tauraxi's eyes softened as she nodded, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. I, Empress Taurasi, vow to stand by you, Captain Harrison. Together we will forge a new path, one that unites our people and leads us toward a future of peace. As the words were spoken, a wave of energy seemed to pass through the room. It wasn't just a ceremonial promise. It was a binding oath, one that would shape their futures in ways neither of them could fully comprehend. The ceremony was complete, and with it, a new chapter in the history of the galaxy had begun. The quiet hum of the palace hall was drowned out by the silence that followed the ceremony. Jake stood there, beside Taurasi, her hand still resting lightly in his, a sense of finality settling over him. The marriage was no longer a distant thought. It was real, it was now. And with it, the weight of responsibility had shifted onto both of their shoulders. The Zalthar nobles who had gathered to witness the union were slowly beginning to disperse, their whispers filling the room. Some were skeptical, others begrudgingly respectful, but all knew that the future had changed. Jake could feel their eyes on him, weighing his every move. The political ramifications of this marriage were far-reaching, but for now, they were alone, Taurasi and him, bound by an oath neither had fully expected to make. Taurasi turned to face him as the last of the crowd faded into the corridors, her gaze softening, though her expression remained composed.
It's done, she said, her voice carrying the weight of both relief and uncertainty.
Jake nodded, still processing everything that had happened. He had known that this would be a challenge, but standing here now, in the heart of the Zalthar Empire, with the entire future of their people at stake, it felt even more daunting. They had taken a bold step forward, but the path ahead was anything but clear.
Now we deal with what comes next, Jake replied, his voice steady.
This marriage, it's only the beginning. Tauraxi's eyes flickered with a hint of something deeper, something that only those who truly knew her would recognize. She was a ruler, yes, but she was also a woman who had lived her life under the shadow of endless war, of endless conquest. Now, that life was changing, and with it, the galaxy itself.
I understand, she said softly.
And I will do everything I can to make this work. Jake gave a quiet smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. We'll need more than just trying to make it work.
We've just united two empires. There will be those who don't want this to succeed.
We'll have to fight for it, just as we fought for our survival. Tauraxi's expression hardened, the cold determination that had marked her as a warrior surfacing once more. We will fight, yes, but we will fight together, You, the human captain, and I, the empress of the Zalfar.
This union is stronger than any force that stands against us. Jake nodded again, though doubt still lingered in the back of his mind.
They had made the right choice, hadn't they? He wasn't sure. But the time for second-guessing was over. He had pledged his life to this cause, and there was no turning back now. The palace was still, and the silence between them seemed to stretch on for an eternity. The reality of their new life together had set in, and it was more overwhelming than anything Jake had imagined. But as he looked at Taraxi, standing beside him, there was a spark of something more. This was not just about politics or power. It was about something deeper, something that neither of them had fully understood until now. Taraxi turned to him, her voice low but firm. We need to address the factions within my empire.
The nobles who oppose this union will not simply fade into the background. They will challenge us.
Jake's brow furrowed. And what do we do about them? Taraxi's gaze was unwavering. We confront them head-on. This marriage may have been ceremonial, but it is also a declaration. A declaration that my rule will not be swayed by the whims of those who seek to undermine it. Jake knew what she meant. There were always those who sought to take power, to manipulate the system for their own gain. The Zalthar Empire was no different. The question was whether they could overcome this internal division and move forward, or if their marriage, this symbol of unity, would become the very thing that tore them apart. We'll need allies, Jake said. We can't fight this battle alone. Taraxi nodded. I have already begun to make the necessary arrangements. There are factions within my court who are loyal to me. We will need their support to maintain control. Jake felt a flicker of hope. The fact that Taraxi was already planning ahead, already preparing for the challenges that lay ahead, was a sign that she wasn't just a ruler for show. She was a leader, capable of handling the burden of command. He could see now that their partnership wasn't just political. They were truly allies, in every sense of the word. The next few hours were spent in a whirlwind of strategy and discussions. Taraxi met with her closest advisors, while Jake accompanied her, offering his perspective as an outsider, someone who had seen the politics of war from the ground level. His input was valued, though he could tell that some of the Zalfar nobles were not pleased with the idea of a human playing such an integral role in their future. But Jake didn't care. His loyalty was to Taraxi and to the cause they were building together. He would fight for this alliance, for this marriage, with everything he had. There was no other choice. By the time the sun began to set, the atmosphere in the palace had shifted. The weight of the ceremony was still palpable, but there was a new energy in the air. Taraxi's leadership had solidified the foundation for their partnership, and Jake had no intention of letting that foundation crumble. As night fell over the Zalthar capital, the quiet hum of the city below seemed to match the tension that hung in the air. The first steps had been taken. The marriage had been solidified, but now the real work began. The following weeks were filled with intense negotiations, public appearances, and strategic meetings. Jake and Taraxi worked together to address the challenges within the empire, facing opposition from those who saw their union as a threat to their power. But as time went on, Jake began to see that Taraxi's vision for the future was not just a dream, it was a plan. And together, they could make it a reality. One evening, as they stood together on the balcony of the palace, looking out over the sprawling city, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder. The vastness of the empire stretched before him, its beauty undeniable. But it wasn't just the city he saw. It was the future. His future, and Taraxi's, one that was intertwined in ways neither of them had anticipated. I never thought I'd be here, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. Taraxi turned to him, her expression softening. Neither did I. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their words hanging between them. There was still much to be done, many obstacles to overcome. But in that moment, Jake realized that they were no longer just two separate individuals, two separate factions. They were a team, bound by something deeper than politics or power. "We've come a long way," Jake said, his voice filled with conviction. Taxi nodded. "And we will continue to move forward together." As they stood there, side by side, watching the stars twinkle in the sky, Jake knew that this was only the beginning. Their marriage had been the spark that ignited a new era for the Zalfar Empire and humanity. Together, they would fight for a future where peace was possible, not just for them, but for everyone. The challenges ahead were many, but Jake wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't in this alone. And as long as they stood together, nothing could tear them apart.